We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 70a. The Gemara continues, V'noagu b'nei kufra, these sailors, they have a minhag, they have a custom, agra b'shas mashicha, that they pay the rent at the time of the pulling, at the time of the kinyan, and pigra b'shas shvira, and they pay for the damages at the time that it breaks. Rashi explains, V'noagu b'nei kufra, ba'alei svina, again this refers to the sailors, kari b'nei kufra, the reason why they're called b'nei kufra, l'fisha zovsen osam b'zef, is because they use pitch. And so in any case, again, the situation over here is they pay rent and they take responsibility for the damages. Rashi explains, Igra b'shas mashicha nosan osam miyad. The rent they pay immediately at the time of the mashicha when they pull it. V'afal pisha kibel schar. Now, even though they're paying this rent, nosan lo pigra l'kashati shaver, they also pay for the damages if it should break. And so the Gemara says, Atu b'minhag tal yamilsa. What do you mean it's a custom of the sailors? Is this something that's dependent on a minhag? As Rashi explains, Atu b'minhag tal yamilsa hechishav kinan lahu l'kabel schar hoel v'sofu l'kno sakula. How can you say that there's going to be rent over here, that they're paying rent, if in the end they're also taking full responsibility on the item? Isn't this a problem of ribis? And so the Gemara answers to that, Mishum de masnisa tanya minhaga, because of the brisa. That's why we talk about the minhag over here. And Rashi explains, Mishum de masnisa tanya de mutter. It's because the brisa on the previous Amud said that this arrangement is mutter. And the reason the brisa gave is because you're not paying while it's alive, or meaning to say while it's intact, only after death, and so therefore it's permitted. That's what we said in the previous Amud. So it's for that reason that nog minhaga. That's why they have the custom. They have the custom based on the fact that it's mutter according to the brisa. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravanan Amar Shmuel. Ravanan says that Shmuel says, Mos shel yisomim mutter l'halvoson beribis. The money of orphans, you're allowed to lend that money out for interest. Amar le Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to him, Mishum de yasmi ninu, just because they're orphans, safina lu isura, therefore we're allowed to feed them isur, something that's prohibited. They're allowed to lend money with ribis, doesn't make sense. And the Gemara continues, Yasmi da'achli delavditu, if orphans are consuming something that really doesn't belong to them, leizlu basar shevkayu, let them follow the person that left them behind, essentially saying it's inappropriate for them to be taking ribis. And so the Gemara says, Amar le said to him, Emali izu gufa de'uvda hechiava, tell me exactly what was the situation. Amar le said to him, Ahu doda devnei mar ukva. There was a certain kettle that belonged to the children of Mar Ukva, the Hava Bei Mar Shmuel, that was at the house of Mar Shmuel. Takel v'yoivle, takel v'shakele. And Rashi explains, takel v'yoivle, takel v'shakele. He weighed it and he gave it out, and then he weighed it and he took it back. And Rashi explains, Hayamaskira lachem, he would rent it out to others. V'shakele kashu mosralam, he weighed it when he gave it to them. V'chozer mekabla v'mishkol, and then when he got it back, he weighed it as well. Im chaser nechushta, if it was missing any of its copper, meshalman lo demei chesrona, he would pay that which was missing. V'yoivle demei, and also there would be rent that was paid. So in other words, in this situation, they were taking responsibility on anything that was missing, and they were paying rent as well, and that was the problem of the ribis. As the Gemara continues, shakal agra v'shakal pichsa, they took the rent, and then they also took for anything that was missing, anything that was damaged. And so agra lo pichsa, v'pichsa lo agra, if they're taking rent, they shouldn't take that which is damaged. If they're taking damages, they shouldn't take the rent. Again, it seems to be a problem of ribis. And so the Gemara continues, Amar Lei said to him, Kiha, in such a situation, afilu b'diknani nami shari lemevad, even if they were older orphans, it would be permitted. It's not a problem at all. Because the owners are accepting upon themselves any of the depreciation of the remaining copper, because as the copper is burned away, as it's missing, so then the value actually goes down. And so therefore, since the orphans were taking upon themselves that depreciation, that's essentially in exchange for the rent that they were receiving, and therefore it is not a problem of ribis. And Rashi explains, Pichsa, Chisra, Nechushta, those who are renting, they're going to pay for the deficiency of the copper as well. Now, if you're going to say that it's usher for orphans to lend out for interest, the Igralo Pichsa, if they're going to be taking rent, then the person who's taking it from them shouldn't also be paying for that copper which is missing. Lama Nos and Schar, why are they giving rent as well? If the people renting it are taking upon themselves the physical damage, so then they shouldn't pay rent as well. That should be a problem of ribis. And the Gemara said in that situation, even bidiknani, even biyasomim gedolim, even when they were older orphans, shenesmali zakonim, they have full beards. That's what it means bidiknani. Ve'enon kriyim yisomim, they're not even called orphans in that case. Shari, that would still be permitted to hamekabli alayu chuscha denechashta, because the orphans were accepting upon themselves the fact that it depreciates in value, meaning whatever copper is remaining. Pechas demeanachoshes shenishar, meaning if the value of the copper that remains goes down, they're accepting that. Ken mefarish va'azil, like the Gemara goes on to explain explained, the cholma de mikli nechasha, because as the copper is being burned away, batzri dameh, so then what remains is going down in value. Afal pisha mishalmin as choser hamishkol, even though the people renting are paying for that which is missing. Yesh pechas benechoshes hanoserbo. There's also a depreciation of the remaining copper hanisraf ba'or, which was burned by fire. V'chol nechoshes soraf dama pechusim. Anytime you have copper that was burned, so the value goes down. So even though they're making up for the lost weight, the actual physically missing copper, but still those renters are not paying for the depreciation of the value of the remaining copper, and that's why when they pay rent, it is okay. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava bar Shila, Amar Rav Chisda. Rava bar Shila says that Rav Chisda says, V'amri lo, and some have the version, Amar Rava bar Yosef bar Chama, Amar Rav Sheshes, that Rava bar Yosef bar Chama said that Rav Sheshes said, Most shall yisomim, when it comes to the money of orphans, mutter lahalvoson, karov l'schar v'rachok lehefsid. You're allowed to lend it out in a scenario, in an arrangement, where it's likely that they will profit, and it's unlikely that they will lose out. Rashi explains, Karov l'schar, it's likely that they'll make profit. Shall yisomim notlin chelik b'schar. The idea over here is that the orphans are going to take a portion of the profit. Ve'ein notlin chelik b'hefsid, they're not going to take a portion of the loss. Avol ribis mamishlo, but you can't do actual ribis. Elamashi yistakru mosem yachloku, just that which there's a profit in terms of the money, they're going to divide it. V'afagav devidiknani aser. Now, even though if they were older and they wouldn't be orphans, this would be forbidden. Lav ribis mamishu. This is not considered actual ribis. Ela avak ribisu. It's considered to be a hint of ribis. Umidrabanan, the prohibition would only be midrabanan. Uviyasmi, when it comes to orphans, lo gazu. They didn't make such a gezerah that you can't do it. Shalo yichlu moseim la'achilam pruta achar pruta. We don't want the money of the orphans that it should be completely consumed, that they're just consuming it one pruta after another. We want to keep it intact, keep the principle, maybe even grow it, and therefore you're allowed to create such an arrangement when it comes to orphans. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Karov l'schar v'rachuk lehefsid rush. If somebody does a business arrangement where it's likely he's going to profit and unlikely that he's going to lose, that's essentially a kind of an interest arrangement, so he's considered a rasha, he's considered wicked. Let's say it's the reverse, Karov lehefsid, it's likely that he's going to lose, v'rachuk l'schar, and it's unlikely he will profit, so chassid, then he's considered a pious individual. Karov lazev rachuk mizeh, let's say it's equal chance of profit, equal chance of loss. Zuhi midas kol adam, that is the way of regular people. Amarle Rabba Rav Yosef, Rabba said to Rav Yosef, Hani zuze diyasmi hechi avdinan lahu. And we have the money of orphans, what do we do with that money? Amarle said to him, Mosvinan lahu beidin, and we put it by the bezdin, we give it to the courts. V'yavinan lahu zuza, and then the bezdin will distribute it them one zuz at a time, and they will give them what they need. Amarle said to him, V'akakal yakarna, but if you do that, the principle is going to be destroyed. They're going to lose all their money in that fashion. So Amarle, so he said to him, Mar hechiavit, so the master, what do you do with the money of orphans? Amarle said to him, but kinon gavra, we find a person, the islay dava pricha, who has scraps of gold, v'naktinon and dahava minei, we take the gold from him, v'yavinon lehu nehile, and then we give it to him, karav l'schar v'rachak lehefsid. In other words, we use the money of the orphans to buy this gold from him, and then they give the gold over to him, and they create an arrangement where it's likely they will profit and unlikely they will lose, and that way we'll keep the money intact for them. And so the Gemara says, Aval davar mesuyim lo, but if you're not going to take from him, you'll take scraps of gold, but you're not going to take specific items, specific merchandise. And the reason is because Dilma Pikadon Ninu, there's a concern, maybe it's not even really his item, maybe it was a Pikadon, it was a deposit, V'yasi Mare, and then the owner will eventually come, Yoav Simonim, he'll give signs on the item, a shakale, he'll take it, and it's going to turn out the orphans will lose out. It's more likely that it's his if it's scraps of gold. That's why we specifically do this with scraps of gold. The Gemara continues, Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, Teinachim mishtakach gavra disle dava pricha. Well, that all works well if you can actually find the person with scraps of gold. Ilo mishtakach gavra disle dava pricha. But if you can't find the person with scraps of gold, nechlu zuze diasmi, should we just let the money of the orphans be consumed? So Elo Amar Ravashi, rather Ravashi says, Chazinan gavra de mishpu nichse. We find a person where his property is quiet. There's no claims against his property. Umehem, and he's trustworthy. V'sham adina doraisa, he listens to the Torah. V'lo mekabel shamta derabbanan. He's not an excommunication by the Rabbanan, meaning to say overall, in general, he's a trustworthy person. V'yahavinan lehu nehile bebeidin, and we give it to him in court, and in that fashion, again, we properly take care of the money of the orphans, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Amud Beis.